Auction of Innocence. Sophie Bennett clutched the small amethyst pendant hanging from her neck as she peeked through the curtains at the glittering crowd. The annual Manhattan Charity Gala's bachelor and bachelorette auction was not where she had imagined finding herself, but desperation had a way of reshaping one's boundaries. 5 minutes, everyone, announced the coordinator, surveying the lineup of New York's most eligible singles with approval before frowning slightly at Sophie. Remember to smile, dear. Nobody bids on a frightened rabbit. Sophie nodded, smoothing down the borrowed emerald dress that felt foreign against her skin. Back home in Millfield, she wore cardigans and jeans to the family bookstore, not couture that cost more than 3 months' rent. But with the bank threatening foreclosure on Bennett books, the store her grandparents had built from nothing, Sophie had accepted her college roommate Olivia's bizarre suggestion: join the auction, charm a wealthy bidder, and walk away with enough to save the store. Just dinner, Sophie, she whispered to herself. One night of your time to save everything that matters. Across the ballroom, Julian Blackwood checked his watch impatiently. At 35, he had built Blackwood Investments into an empire that struck fear and respect throughout Wall Street. He hadn't planned on attending tonight until learning that Vanessa Sinclair would be there, his former fiancée who had recently merged her family's company with his chief competitor. Didn't expect to see you slumming at charity events, came a silky voice. Speak of the devil. Julian turned to face Vanessa, her red dress calculated for maximum impact. I support worthy causes, he replied coolly. Like your ego? She laughed, gesturing toward the stage. Or are you shopping tonight? You always did prefer transactions to relationships. Before Julian could respond, the auction began. He nursed his scotch as attractive people paraded across the stage, garnering enthusiastic bids. He remained unmoved until a slender woman with chestnut hair stumbled slightly as she entered the spotlight. Unlike the others, she didn't strut or pose. Her smile looked fragile, and her eyes, a striking hazel, darted nervously around the room. She looked like she belonged in a library rather than this vulgar display. Next, we have Sophie Bennett. Sophie loves books, baking, and moonlit walks. Who will start the bidding at $2,000? Bids rose steadily to $10,000. Julian found himself studying her, the way she fidgeted with a small pendant, how she bit her lower lip. There was something undeniably authentic about her discomfort. $25,000, called Vanessa's business partner, Alexander Reed, with a predatory smile. Sophie's face paled visibly under the lights. $100,000, Julian heard himself say. The room fell silent. Vanessa's eyes narrowed in his direction. $100,000 going once, twice. Sold to Mr. Blackwood. Later, as Sophie approached him in the reception area, Julian noted her trembling hands and wary expression. Not the practiced coyness he was accustomed to from women. Mr. Blackwood, she said softly, thank you for your generosity, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I don't have misunderstandings, Ms. Bennett, Julian interrupted. I'll send my driver for you tomorrow at 8. Wear whatever makes you comfortable. He handed her his card, their fingers brushing momentarily. For an instant, something unexpected flickered across Julian's face, a response to that innocent touch that unsettled him more than any billion-dollar negotiation ever had. The arrangement. Sophie stared at the business card long after Julian Blackwood had disappeared into the crowd. The embossed lettering seemed to mock her predicament. $100,000, the exact amount needed to save Bennett books, in exchange for an evening with a man known as the Vulture of Wall Street. You hit the jackpot, Olivia squealed, rushing over. Julian Blackwood never participates in these events. Half the women in Manhattan would kill for your position. I'm not sure what position that is exactly, Sophie murmured. What does he expect? The following evening, Sophie waited outside her modest sublet apartment, having opted for a simple blue dress rather than another borrowed designer piece. When a sleek black car arrived, she was surprised to find Julian himself behind the wheel instead of the promised driver. I decided to come myself, he explained, his expression unreadable as he opened the passenger door. I thought you might be more comfortable without an audience. The gesture, small as it was, caught her off guard. As they drove through the glittering Manhattan streets, Sophie found her voice. "Mr. Blackwood, Julian," he corrected. "Julian, I should be honest. I'm not experienced with this sort of arrangement." His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "What sort of arrangement do you believe this to be?" Her cheeks burned. "The auction. The expectations. I've never—" She faltered. Julian pulled the car into a private parking garage beneath an elegant building. When they stopped, he turned to study her, his expression softening imperceptibly. "The only expectation I have is dinner conversation, Miss Bennett." "Sophie," she offered quietly. The restaurant turned out to be a private rooftop garden atop his building, a lush, intimate space with twinkling lights and a breathtaking view of the city. "I prefer privacy," Julian explained, noting her surprise. "The press can be intrusive." Over an exquisite meal prepared by a personal chef who discreetly disappeared after serving, Julian asked about Bennett books. Sophie's face transformed as she spoke about the store, her passion evident in every word. "My parents died when I was 18. The store and my younger sister Amy became my responsibility overnight. That place has been our anchor through everything." "And now it's in financial trouble," Julian stated rather than asked. Sophie hesitated. "Yes, a chain bookstore opened nearby. We've been struggling ever since." "So you sold yourself to the highest bidder?" There was no judgment in his tone, merely assessment. "I sold one evening of my time," Sophie corrected, meeting his gaze directly. "There's a difference." Julian's lips curved slightly. "Indeed there is." He leaned forward. "I'm curious, have you ever dated anyone seriously, Sophie?" The question caught her off guard. "I've been too busy for relationships." "Between raising Amy and running the store," she trailed off, then added softly, "I haven't even been kissed since high school prom." Something shifted in Julian's expression. Surprise, followed by an emotion Sophie couldn't identify. For a man renowned for his poker face in business, he suddenly seemed disarmed. "The money," he said abruptly. "It will be transferred tomorrow. No strings attached." Sophie blinked. "But we've barely started our evening." Julian studied her, his usual calculated demeanor temporarily suspended. "Consider my curiosity satisfied. You're not what I expected, Sophie Bennett. Is that good or bad?" Instead of answering, Julian stood and walked to the edge of the rooftop. "Would you like to see more of the city? Not as an obligation, but as my guest?" Sophie joined him at the railing, their shoulders almost touching. "I'd like that," she said honestly, "but only if you tell me why you really bid on me tonight." Julian looked down at her, something vulnerable flickering behind his steel blue eyes. "Perhaps I recognize something in you that I'd forgotten existed." Walls crumbling. 3 weeks had passed since the auction, and Sophie still couldn't explain how dinner had somehow evolved into regular meetings with Julian Blackwood. Today found them walking through Central Park, an unlikely pair, the ruthless financier and the small-town bookseller. "You didn't have to help with Amy's college applications," Sophie said, watching autumn leaves spiral around them. "But thank you. Your connections at Columbia will make a difference." Julian shrugged, but the gesture lacked its usual dismissiveness. "Your sister has talent. She deserves the opportunity." They had settled into a strange friendship, Julian showing Sophie his New York while she gradually revealed pieces of herself. She had discovered that behind his intimidating reputation lay a man who remembered how she took her tea, who listened attentively when she spoke of books, who never pushed for more than she offered. "You're staring," Julian noted, amusement warming his typically cool tone. "I'm trying to reconcile the man who once foreclosed on an entire apartment building with someone who just spent an hour helping a teenager with her essay." Julian's expression darkened. "Don't mistake occasional decency for weakness. I built my company by being ruthless when necessary." "I don't think kindness is weakness," Sophie replied. "I think it's your armor that's starting to crack." Before Julian could respond, a striking woman approached them, her smile calculated. "Julian, darling, what a coincidence." "Vanessa," Julian acknowledged stiffly. "I doubt anything about this encounter is coincidental." Vanessa's gaze slid dismissively over Sophie. Still with your auction prize? How charitable. She turned back to Julian. Everyone's wondering if you've gone soft, Julian. First overpaying for this little entertainment, then pulling out of the Reynolds acquisition. Sophie felt Julian tense beside her, his jaw tightening. We're late for our reservation, he said curtly, placing his hand lightly at the small of Sophie's back as they walked away. Who was that? Sophie asked once they were alone. Someone from my past who enjoys creating complications. The protective way Julian guided her through the park entrance suggested more history than he admitted. Later, at a small Italian restaurant far from his usual haunts, Julian's phone buzzed repeatedly until he finally silenced it with a grimace. Business never stops, Sophie observed. It's nothing urgent, he replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. Their dinner arrived, and as they ate, Sophie noticed Julian watching her, not with the calculating assessment of their first meeting, but with something deeper, more contemplative. What? She asked, self-conscious. You've changed things, he said quietly. I find myself declining meetings to spend afternoons in a bookstore. My assistant thinks I've lost my mind. Sophie smiled. The fearsome Julian Blackwood brought down by literature and conversation. Is that what you think this is? His tone had shifted, intensity replacing casual banter. Just conversation? The air between them changed, charged with unspoken possibilities. Sophie's heart raced as Julian leaned closer, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips. I should warn you, she whispered. I might be terrible at this. Julian's hand gently cupped her cheek. Impossible, he murmured, before closing the distance between them. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened with unexpected tenderness. Sophie felt herself respond instinctively, her inexperience forgotten in the warmth spreading through her body. When they finally parted, Julian rested his forehead against hers. I haven't felt this way in a very long time, he admitted, vulnerability evident in his usually guarded expression. Sophie realized that walls were crumbling on both sides, her protective, independence and his emotional fortress, leaving them both exposed in ways neither had anticipated. When he raised his auction paddle 3 weeks ago, neither have I, she confessed. Ever. Betrayal and truth. Sophie's phone buzzed insistently early Sunday morning. Untangling herself from Julian's arms, where she'd fallen asleep watching old films in his penthouse, she reached for it groggily. Sophie, it's Amy. Have you seen the news? Fully awake now, Sophie sat upright. What news? You're all over the tabloids. Wall Street shark pays for virgin conquest. There are pictures from the auction, Sophie. They're saying terrible things. The room seemed to tilt as Sophie opened the link Amy sent. There she was on the auction stage, looking terrified. With the headline, Blackwood's latest acquisition, innocent small-town girl purchased for $100K. The article detailed how Julian Blackwood had bought an inexperienced nobody, quoting inside sources who revealed Sophie had never been in a serious relationship before becoming his latest plaything. Her eyes blurred with tears as she read comments speculating on whether he'd gotten his money's worth. Behind her, Julian stirred. Sophie, what's wrong? She turned, phone extended, unable to speak. His expression hardened as he scanned the article, jaw clenching. I'll handle this, he said, reaching for his own phone. Handle it? Sophie's voice shook. How exactly do you handle my humiliation being splashed across the internet? They're treating me like a transaction, Julian finished quietly. Sophie, I had nothing to do with this. No? Her hurt was giving way to anger. Then how did they know such personal details? Things I've only told you? Julian's eyes narrowed. Vanessa, she must have... Stop. Sophie stood, gathering her sweater. I trusted you with things I've never told anyone. Was I just another challenge? The inexperienced girl you could add to your collection? That's not fair, Julian said, his composure slipping. You know that's not what happened between us. Do I? Tears spilled down her cheeks. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what everyone is saying. You bought me at that auction, and I was naive enough to believe it meant something more. Julian reached for her, but Sophie stepped back. Don't, she took a shaky breath. I need to go home, to Millfield. This was all a mistake. "Sophie, please!" Something raw and vulnerable flashed across his face. "Let me explain." But Sophie was already moving toward the door, shame and betrayal overwhelming everything else. "The money saved my bookstore." "Let's just leave it at that, Mr. Blackwood." The formality struck Julian like a physical blow. "At least let me drive you—" "No." Her voice broke on the word. "I think you've done enough." When the elevator doors closed behind her, Julian stood motionless, feeling something crumble inside him. Something he'd thought long dead until Sophie had awakened it. Back in Millfield, 3 days later, Sophie tried to lose herself in the familiar rhythms of Bennett Books. She'd turned off her phone after the 20th call from Julian, unable to bear hearing his voice. "You should talk to him," Amy said, watching her sister mechanically shelving books. "He's called the store twice today." "There's nothing to say." Sophie pushed a strand of hair behind her ear, trying to ignore the hollow ache in her chest. "So you're just going to hide here forever?" The Sophie who faced down that auction would have demanded answers. "That Sophie was a fool," she muttered. The bell above the door jingled, and Sophie turned to greet the customer, only to freeze at the sight of Vanessa Sinclair's elegant figure. "Quaint little shop," Vanessa observed, running a manicured finger along a bookshelf. "We're closed," Sophie stated flatly. Vanessa ignored her. "You know, when I leaked those details to the press, I expected Julian to drop you immediately. Damage control is usually his specialty." She examined Sophie with clinical curiosity. "Instead, he's been tearing New York apart looking for me, threatening lawsuits against every publication that ran the story." Sophie's heart pounded. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm impressed," Vanessa admitted reluctantly. 15 years I've known that man, and I've never seen him fight for anyone the way he's fighting for you." She placed a manila envelope on the counter. "These are all the original emails I sent to the press. My admission of guilt, shall we say?" Sophie stared at the envelope. "Why would you help me?" Vanessa's perfect composure slipped, revealing something almost like regret. "Because some games aren't worth winning, Miss Bennett. And because even I can recognize when something is real." With that, she turned and left, the bell chiming in her wake. Sophie opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding evidence that Julian had indeed been innocent of the press leak. As she processed this revelation, her phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "Check the news again." The headline that appeared made her breath catch. "Blackwood Enterprises announces major investment in independent bookstores nationwide." More than a price rain pounded against the windows of Bennett Books as Sophie locked up for the evening. The storm matched her tumultuous thoughts as she considered the packet from Vanessa and Julian's bookstore initiative, which had dominated business news for days. A knock at the door startled her. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could make out a familiar silhouette, Julian, drenched, and without his usual driver or umbrella. Sophie hesitated, then unlocked the door. "You're soaking wet." "I've been waiting outside for an hour," he admitted, water dripping from his hair. "I wasn't sure you'd see me." The man before her hardly resembled the intimidating figure from the auction. His customary armor, designer suit, perfect composure, calculating gaze, had been replaced by vulnerability and something that looked remarkably like hope. "Your bookstore program," Sophie began. "If that was meant to impress me, it wasn't," Julian interrupted. "Or not entirely. After you left, I kept thinking about what you said about Bennett Books being an anchor for your community. I started researching and found that independent bookstores everywhere are struggling against chains and online retailers. The investment fund made business sense." Sophie studied him, searching for the calculating businessman. "And the personal sense?" Julian ran a hand through his wet hair. "I've spent 15 years building walls around myself, convinced that business was the only thing that wouldn't betray me. Then you walked onto that auction stage, terrified but determined, and something in me recognized something in you." He took a step closer. "You weren't just another bid, Sophie. You were the wake-up call I didn't know I needed." "I read Vanessa's emails," Sophie admitted. "Why didn't you just tell me she was behind the leak?" "Would you have believed me?" His question held no accusation, only sad understanding. I've built a reputation on ruthless deals and calculated risks. People like me are expected to use people like you. Thunder rumbled outside as they stood in the quiet bookshop, surrounded by stories of other people's lives while trying to navigate their own. I missed you, Sophie confessed. I kept picking up books and thinking about what you'd say about them. Julian's smile was tentative. I bought copies of all your favorites. My assistant thinks I've lost my mind. Have you? Sophie asked softly. Completely, he admitted, closing the distance between them. I came here without a plan for the first time in my life. Just the certainty that whatever this is between us matters more than any deal I've ever made. Sophie reached up to brush a raindrop from his cheek. No more auctions, she whispered. No more arrangements. If we do this, we're just two people choosing each other. Julian's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. I choose you, Sophie Bennett. Not as a transaction or an acquisition, but as the woman who made me remember what it feels like to want something I can't buy. Their kiss tasted of rain and promises, deepening as Sophie wound her arms around his neck. When they finally parted, Julian rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I think I have since that first night when you told me your family's bookstore mattered more than your pride. You've been teaching me about value ever since. Sophie smiled against his lips. I love you too. The man beneath the reputation who remembers how I take my tea and argues passionately about 19th century literature. Outside, the storm began to ease, raindrops softening against the windows as Julian pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. This isn't a purchase, he clarified as Sophie's eyes widened. It's a question. Opening the box revealed not a diamond, but a delicate silver pendant with an open book charm, an exact replica of the Bennett Books logo. Will you write the next chapter with me? Julian asked. Whatever it looks like, wherever it takes us. Sophie touched the pendant, then looked up at the man who had bid for an evening but found a future. Yes, she whispered. Every page. In the quiet bookshop where Sophie had preserved her family's legacy, they began writing their own story, one that had begun with a price but had become something no amount of money could ever measure.